Well, thank you so much for having me, and it is a pleasure to be amongst you all tonight. I stand before you, a proud product of the state education system, but please don't hold that against it. Over the course of the evening, I hope to persuade you that not only do private schools dodge their social responsibility through their VAT exemption and charitable status, and let's be honest, the whole charitable status thing is a con, because providing the children of people who can afford tens of thousands of pounds a year an inflated chance of going to Oxford is not a charitable endeavour. I think we can all agree on that. But as well as finicking over tax status, I really do hope to persuade you tonight that private schools as a whole are corrosive to our society. And they're corrosive to our society because they rob other kids, working class kids, middle income kids, of opportunity. They're corrosive because they segregate children on the basis of class. And because the wealthy have the option of going private, private schools have facilitated the 14-year-long austerity experiment which has systematically underfunded the education of the 93% of British children who attend state schools, who don't go to independent schools. So quickly, show of hands, who here believes in the principle of meritocracy? Who thinks that one's talents should dictate how far you go in life? Great, you're all on my side. Because private schools don't operate on the basis of meritocracy, they operate on the basis of money. It is money and not merit that determines how far you go. There is a quid pro quo. If you hand over the equivalent of half the nation's average wage every year at a minimum, if you hand that sum over on fees, your child has an increased chance of ending up as a part of other elite institutions. And to be fair, the numbers, as Fraser reminded us, do back it up. 7% of the UK population attends private school for secondary education, and yet these pupils end up having a stranglehold on British public life. They produce 74% of senior judges, 59% of permanent secretaries in the civil service. They produce 54% of top journalists, and to date, 85% of British prime ministers. And I don't think that anyone would look at media or politics and think, yeah, we're really getting the best and brightest. There's no justifying these figures on the basis of talent, but what they show is that through networks, cultural capital, and actual capital, a handful of institutions produce the class of people who dictate the terms of public life. But it's not only the fact that we are governed by a class of posh mediocrities that should upset you. It's also that it takes away opportunities from poorer kids. Because again, that 7% of privately educated pupils, they make up over 30% of Oxford places, more than 60% of places at the Royal College of Music, nearly 70% of places at the Courtauld Institute of Art. And so what does that mean? It means that 7% of the most financially privileged pupils in the country get an unfair bite at the apple. And 93% of pupils are left scrabbling for just 30% of the spots at some of the country's top institutions. So don't tell me that private schools open up opportunities for working class kids, because the numbers don't lie. Whatever crumbs, and they are crumbs, which get offered through scholarships or bursaries or that nice day once a year where you can go and look at the grounds that you can't attend, those crumbs are vastly outweighed by the opportunities that private schools block at the societal level. Now, I want to talk about class segregation, and I do believe that segregation is the correct word. Because if we were having a debate about schools which were segregated on the basis of race, but don't worry, 10% of the places, or maybe even 20% of the places, are theoretically available to Black and Asian school children, we wouldn't be defending that. We would rightly be outraged. We would say that is deeply unfair. You are encoding an unfair practice at the heart of your institution. But here we are, debating whether or not it's right to segregate the best resourced and most well-networked schools in our society on the basis of class. And honestly, that makes me despair. As mentioned earlier, I went to a comprehensive girls' school in North London for secondary, and it was truly diverse. Doesn't mean it was always easy, but it did mean that it was never dull. The pupil intake, it ranged from girls who were solidly middle class to girls whose parents were mechanics to girls who were in and out of the care system, girls who were refugees. And I will never ever forget the time when in year 7, I made a friend and I brought her back for tea, and it turned out that my mum was her social worker. And I'm sure that for many parents, that would fill you with dread and terror. The idea that you're sending your kid to attend a school and other children may have come from literal war zones, both at home and abroad. But retaining a system of social apartheid where kids from disadvantaged backgrounds don't get to breathe the same rarefied air as kids from more privileged ones, that is the thing that I find terrifying. Because what I learned is that kids from those tougher backgrounds, they have so much to give. Because I learned a lot about life every day. And I learned a lot about life from the girl who'd come from Somaliland, and she was having to learn English. Both the Queen's English that she learnt in her English lessons and the North London kind, which we were teaching her in the playground. And we know from study after study that socio-economically integrated schools produce better results for disadvantaged pupils. And I think it's good. I think it's an inherently good thing when people from challenging backgrounds aren't abandoned by those from more stable or more affluent upbringings. Because what kind of message do you think it sends when you say that those kids, I mean, also kids like me, were simply too dangerous, too rambunctious, and too poor to share a classroom with? But in addition to that, I think that diverse state schools, they produce better learning environments than the socially impoverished experience at fee-paying schools. I think that you learn more about the world, you learn more about yourself, you learn more about the people that you're, I think, privileged to share a country with. And I don't think it's right that for many amongst those 74% of privately educated judges, maybe the first time they encounter someone who went through the care system is when they're sentencing them. When Nicky Morgan became Education Secretary in 2014, not one single minister in her department had attended a state school, and that same year, the Department of Education proposed a £200 million cut to local councils' education funding. And between 2010 and 2021, per pupil funding for state schools was cut by 14 percentage points. And I don't think that those things exist separately from the private school system. I think it was made possible because of the private school system. Because you're not going to be punished by the voters you count on if they've got a safer option for their kids, and they don't have to send their kids to the schools which have the crumbling concrete or are beset by strikes or have teacher retention problems. The existence of the private sector for wealthy parents means that governments can get away with murder in the state sector. And it's just so much easier to impose unjust sentences, write unjust stories, and craft unjust legislation when you've had little contact with the people who'll be most affected by it. And look, here's the simple thing that I want to say. If private schools didn't confer an unfair advantage, nobody would fucking pay for them. The existence of private schools wages war on meritocracy because it tells kids that having money will get you further in life than having talent, and that there's no need to understand the country even if you want to be part of the class who gets to run it. And I think that state schools at their very best can represent what the country can be in miniature. Socially mixed, a level playing field, a place where people from radically different backgrounds can learn from one another. And I think if we were serious about meritocracy, which you've all just told me you believe in, you would actually want to weaken the private school sector. You wouldn't want to let them get away with tax-exempt status. You wouldn't want to let them get away with presenting themselves as charities. And maybe you wouldn't want them to exist at all. But until that sweet day, where we no longer have fee-paying schools in this country, marring the principle of fairness that we should all live by, I'll settle for scrapping the VAT exemption. So please, I implore you to vote against this motion.